Out in the woods, it's common to hear a branch or twig snapping, but if you're very unlucky, it may just be the limbs of a werewolf snapping as it transforms into an abomination ready to tear any campers apart. Today's stories are about werewolves and dogmen allegedly actually seen in the woods, so scrounge up any silver you have and be ready for a fight. These are werewolf and dogmen seen in the woods. If you have a scary story and want it narrated, share it with us at darkstories.org. If you want to listen to stories like these while you work, drive, jog, or sleep, search for and follow the Darkness Prevails podcast on Spotify and iTunes. And if you've got a moment, please leave us a review on iTunes too. Thank you. Now, let's begin. Warning. The following story contains a depiction of half-eaten animals. Vomiter. From Anonymous. When I was a kid, I loved exploring the woods and picking mushrooms. My dad taught me which kinds were edible and which weren't, and my mom really knew how to cook them up if I got the right kinds. We lived in the Midwest, where autumns could get really cold, and midway into October, there would be an ocean of leaves in every direction. Autumn was my favorite season. To me, the temperature was perfect, and the scenery was at its most beautiful. So it's no wonder that I would explore the woods more often during the fall months. My mom and dad were fine with that, as long as I came home before sundown. This particular experience taught me why getting home before it's dark is always the best idea. Let's just say, if you stay after dark, you might see something you regret. This happened in 1983, so I would have been 10 years old. I went walking through the wooded trails a few hours before sundown. I soon found myself distracted. I was excited at the amount of mushrooms I was finding, and I really regretted not going home to get the basket I often used. Instead, I was sticking as many in my shirt as I possibly could. When I had as much as I could carry, I started to head back home, but it only took a few seconds for me to realize I'd gotten myself lost. I may have grown up around these woods, I may have been exploring them for years, but even experienced hikers can find themselves lost for good in the wilderness. The thought of that really scared me. It was something my dad had always reminded me of. You see, he took pride in how much I liked being outdoors. He did everything he could to teach me to be independent, yet safe out here. Even so, the worst had happened. I no longer recognized where I was, and I had no clue what direction the trail lay. I remember being told to not panic in this kind of situation, as you'll likely end up getting more lost than you originally were. So I stood there for a while, studying my surroundings, hoping that something would ring familiar in my head, then it would all come together at once. But that wasn't happening. I then racked my brain to remember what else my dad had taught me. "If you're lost, son," he had said, "stay put, and we'll come find you." That's right. I couldn't have been more than a mile in, I knew that. And I knew that if I tried to find my way back to the path in a panic, I could end up a number of miles away from my home. Finding a wide and ancient sassafras tree nearby, I sat with my back against it, scattering the mushrooms on the ground beside me neatly. I was confident that my dad would find me. They knew what trails I went on, and they would know to search near those trails. I wanted to call out, but my father had taught me to do that as a last resort. We had lost a lot of dogs around here to mountain lions and bears and even coyotes. And back in that region, during that time period, they were known to attack people too. "It's rare," my dad would say, "but they can tell how big you are from your voice more often than not, and a kid like you would be easy pickings." I shuddered at the thought. These days, survival skills might be something far different than what my dad taught me, but we were country folk, trying to do our best to live and let live. After about an hour of sitting there, it was completely dark, and I knew by then my parents were probably frustrated or already looking for me. After all, this would be the first time I ever stayed out too late. so I assumed their first thought would be that I got lost, not that I was being disobedient. I continued to stay put. I counted the mushrooms over and over again. Then I tried to count the stars through the bare canopy. And when that got boring, I began to just listen to the sounds around me. The wind blowing through trees, nighttime birds complaining about the cold, unseen nighttime critters crawling over the forest floor. And then there was the hacking sound, a sort of wheezing that echoed through the forest in the distance. That was a sound I was not familiar with, and it made me tremble the closer it got. It was getting closer every time I heard it, and the sound would come again every couple of minutes. I was sure it was a bear with allergies or something, and a bear would be bad news, and it was fall, so a bear would be gorging itself for hibernation the following couple of months. I was beginning to panic again. I tried to slowly rotate myself around the tree, keeping my body hidden on the opposite side of the tree to those noises. For about 10 to 15 minutes, I stopped hearing the noises, and I was beginning to calm down. Until... the sound was coming from right behind me, on the other side of the tree. I knew I would find that creature there. A big, nasty, slobbering, and hungry bear. I could see it in my head already. I'd never been more horrified in my life. One wrong move, one wrong sound, and it would all be over for me at just 10 years old. Then again, something about the sound was strange. I had heard and seen bears before, and they'd never made this sound. If it was feeling sick, I mean that sick if it was making those sounds, I felt curious about seeing it. I couldn't believe what was running through my mind. I actually wanted to peek around the tree and see what was wrong with this bear. And as if my body was on autopilot, I began to shift around and turn my head, being careful not to touch any leaves, though they were so incredibly abundant. It took ages just to make that small movement, but I finally made it. What I saw took my breath away. The creature on the other side of the tree was definitely no bear. It seemed more dog-like than anything else. Pointed ears that were laid back, as the creature itself seemed to be in a lot of discomfort. The creature had minimum fat and a lot of muscle, and a coat of fur that was medium in thickness. It really did look like a big wolf or dog. But the shape was disfigured in a way, because its shoulders were extremely broad, at least 3 to 4 times more wide than the waist. That part, at least to me, seemed to resemble a well-built man, with distant flat shoulder blades and a defined spinal column. The face itself, though, was very much like a wolf. Long snout, black wet nose, covered in fur, though the eyes were solid black. As for the entirety of it, it was covered in very dark fur. Whatever kind of wolf or dog this was, it would be perfectly hidden in the dark. Now that was a creepy thought. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't exactly a canine. So what was it? Better yet, what was it doing? As I mentioned before, its ears were laying down flat. As I began to observe it, I saw that the creature's mouth was opened. It was making these wheezing sounds, as if it was ready to hack something up, and I nearly hurled myself when I saw something come out of its throat. I'm sorry if this next part is a little bit gross, but this is what I saw. A chunky, wet mess of solids and liquids came out of its mouth and made a small, disgusting puddle on the forest floor. I could see half-eaten rabbits in there. And as I defied myself to look even closer, I swear to you, to this very day, there was a wristwatch in there. The face was square, the glass was cracked, and the leather straps were partially chewed. No, I'm not saying I think this animal ate someone. Probably got a hold of something in the dumpster. it was still freaky nonetheless. So this thing was sick, probably because the thing ate that watch. Now, at that point, I didn't realize how far I'd been sticking my head out from around the tree. So when the creature's head turned right towards me, I nearly screamed right there. The last important detail I got of this animal was when it snarled. As I sat there, trembling at the sound and sight, I noticed its middlemost and frontmost teeth, the ones right between a dog's longest teeth. They weren't at all sharp. In fact, they were perfectly rectangular, another feature that perfectly resembled a man. Suddenly, the forest behind me came to life, as another large creature began to shuffle through the leaves quickly towards me. But I could not look away from this wolf-like thing until after it took off in the woods, disappearing quickly in the dark thanks to its dark coat. When I turned around to confront this new creature, I found my dad's face, worried and looking in the direction that monster had disappeared into. He saw that pile of bile as well. With a huff, he held my hand and led me back home without a word. I made it home okay, and later that night, after I was scolded for letting myself get lost in the woods, I asked my dad if he had seen that weird animal, and the only thing he would reply, even to this day, was, "Strange things out there. Best be careful next time." That makes me think he knows something that I don't. What was it that I saw? This creature with a wolf's head, human-like teeth in the front, and a broad, muscular back, 3 to 4 times as wide as any canine's. I don't think I'll ever know. But after all these decades, I'm still just as curious. Blueridge Dogman. From Anonymous. I've never told this story to anyone before. I don't want people to think that I'm crazy. I am a professional, and if anyone were to link this story to me, it would affect my practice. Despite that risk, I have to tell someone of this experience, even if it's only anonymously. It happened back when I was 10 years old in the summer of 1979. Looking back, I had an ideal childhood, which can be quite rare these days. I'm from the Triad area of North Carolina, in a location that was relatively rural at the time. I was pretty much a free-range kid. So long as I was home for supper, there weren't any problems. Much of my time was spent playing in the woods and creeks within a mile or so of home. Naturally, being a bit of a country boy, I was obsessed with hunting, fishing, guns, bows, and arrows, but especially deer hunting. I read hunting magazines voraciously, soaking up everything I could about the habits of white-tailed deer, from when and where they moved and what they ate, depending on the time of year. Furthermore, I learned their seasonal diet and how to read deer signs, from rubs, scrapes, spoor, and finding their trails. The experience I wish to relate here did not occur in North Carolina, but up in Virginia. It is a memory that haunts me yet, and is something I'll never be able to forget. As much as I enjoyed the woods and creeks of my home, my grandmother's place in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia was special. That was wilderness compared to the woods of my home. Her land in Carroll County was on a ridge about 1.5 hours from home. It was just a 3-room cabin then, without year-round running water. When the weather was good enough for the unpaved mountain roads to be drivable, we were there most weekends. I would spend most of the day roaming all across the mountain from the top of the ridge to the river below. The nearest neighbor was about a mile away on a state-maintained gravel road, but even then, most of the homes in that area were vacation homes and were normally empty. It was a Saturday in June, and school was out for the summer. We'd go up Friday evening and come back Saturday night. My grandmother was very devout, and probably the sincerest Christian I've ever known. It was Saturday morning, and I had the entire day to explore the mountain. By this time, I had a fairly decent grasp of the habits of the local deer population. Deer are most active at dawn and dusk, and when under pressure, such as during a heavy hunting season, they will become mostly nocturnal, unless they're in rut. But this was June, and hunting season was months away, and rut was a couple months after that, so I made my plans to explore the creek by following it to the river. Then follow the river upstream to the big rock, then hike up the rather steep mountain back to the cabin, stopping for a rest at the shallow cave. Then I would make it back to the cabin about noon for something to eat. Then I'd have to help in my grandmother's garden for a few hours. As you can imagine, that was a busy morning and afternoon. But at 10 years old, there is endless energy, and I had decided to take my binoculars and watch a recently timbered patch of land from the top of the ridge once my chores were done. I set off with a promise to get back just before it got too dark. The only real agriculture in those mountains was raising beef cattle, hay, silage, and some cabbage. The apple orchards were mostly on the southern side of the Blue Ridge, near the tourist areas. Most of what the deer ate around my grandmother's cabin at that time of year would have been tree or perennial browse, and any annuals such as pulkweed and other green leafy plants. They would also obviously eat any berries that were starting to come out around that time. There were a few hours of daylight remaining when I took off up the road with my binoculars and canteen of spring water. The wind had been blowing favorably all day. For those who don't know, while you may fool a deer's eyes, you will not fool his nose. The wind decides pretty much everything when it comes to hunting deer. On this day, the wind was favorable. It was blowing at a crosswind to me when overlooking the cleared little valley. The cleared land went down to the creek and had been timbered the previous winter. It was lush and new growth for the deer to feast upon, but it was still low enough that any adult deer would be visible from my vantage point at the top of the ridge. The other side of the creek remained in timber and thick rhododendron thickets. I got settled in a good couple of hours before dusk. I wanted to be there in plenty of time for the woods to calm down from my walk to my spot, and long before the deer came out. I didn't want to spook any deer on the walk in. As I said, I got settled into my spot and made it as comfortable as I could, and I constructed a rough blind by placing some leafy branches into the ground to break up my outline. This took about 10 minutes. I stretched out and scanned the clear-cut area below me, double-checking the likely areas I expected the deer to come out of the woods into the clearing to browse. Then I just rested, enjoying the pleasant evening, watching birds and small animals. After about an hour and a half, the sun was starting to set, and I took one last drink of water until it got dark. Suddenly, there was a bit of movement down to my right. After scanning the area with the binoculars, I saw that it was a deer and a new fawn. The doe paused at the edge of the clearing to make sure it was safe, while occasionally checking her back trail. It then slowly moved out into the clearing, quickly followed by the fawn. Just one large doe and one fawn, which wasn't a surprise since older does tend to have one fawn, while younger ones more often have two fawns. But the two deer were not alone. Another deer followed them. The 3 deer slowly worked their way up the creek, eating browse as they did so. The doe would pause to allow her fawn to suckle. It was then that I noticed some movement on the opposing hillside. The rhododendron thicket would move. Something large was slowly working its way down the hillside. That rhododendron thicket was especially thick, and while I couldn't see what was moving through it, its movement caused the thicket itself to move. I assumed it was another deer. By this time, it was close to being dark. The 3 deer had taken about 30 minutes to work their way up the little creek from where they had exited the woods. The deer that I expected to come through the rhododendron thicket had never left the thicket to cross the creek, which led me to believe it was an old buck, since they're usually more cautious. By then it was almost dark. Fortunately, though, my binoculars gathered much more light. The binoculars magnified and made everything brighter. If I were not using the binoculars, I would never have seen what happened next. Often since then, I wish that I did not have them that day, and that I had left earlier, but that wasn't to be. What I saw next has never left me since then. The 3 deer reached the spot close to the last spot that I had seen the movement through the rhododendron thicket. Just a moment after the deer once again checked their back trail, there was a sudden commotion from the rhododendron thicket. It was a large animal. It leapt out of the thicket, clearing the small creek. The doe was taken down in an instant. What appeared to be a large wolf had the doe's throat in its powerful jaws. Astounded, I watched what appeared to be a wolf kill its prey. Besides the fact that there haven't been any wolves in Virginia for about 150 years, I noticed that there was something else wrong. The wolf's proportions appeared all wrong. Its front legs were too long, its upper torso too broad to be that of a canine. But then it only became more strange. As the wolf's jaws crushed the windpipe of the doe, I noticed that its front paws were not paws at all. They appeared to be more like hands than paws. Paws which were then holding down the deer in its death rattle. As the wolf-like animal dropped the deer from its jaws, its prey fell to the ground. The creature raised from its crouching position and stood on its hind legs to a height of, I guess, about 7 feet. It looked around, including in my direction. It sniffed the air as it did so. Fortunately, the wind had held steady. I was not downwind from it. I froze in terror. It did not see me. As the light faded, I could tell that the beast was grayish in color. Its fur was thicker around its neck and down its back. Its muzzle was pronounced. Its hind legs were too short in comparison to its front limbs, and while it was muscular, it was not overly so. The beast began tearing into the doe with its teeth. It was then that I decided that a silent retreat was the most sensible thing. All I can say is, I was ever so glad that I had made a decent blind to conceal my retreat, so that I was able to retreat unseen and relatively quietly. It was also fortunate that the beast was distracted by its meal. I returned to my grandmother's cabin under the constant fear of brutal death. I'd never been happier to leave my grandmother's cabin when the time came. That was the last time I ever went there. My grandmother was not one to walk far from the cabin. I attempted to dissuade her from going there as much. Her health began failing her not long afterward, and her trips became less frequent as the years passed. We sold the land and cabin after my grandmother passed. It was only a few years ago that I learned what I witnessed that evening was a dogman. The beast had been active prior to dusk, and I don't believe that a person can turn into a beast. That is my story. I don't know if the dogman I saw, or one of its kind, still roam those hills, but if you're ever in Carroll County, Virginia, be careful. Bayou Wolf, from cryptidlover. I live with my brother while attending an 8-year community college. I walk home from college but get driven to college in the mornings because my brother works night shift at a vet clinic as a guard. It was December 12th of 2018. I was walking home from college around 7:40. It was finals week and the last day of the fall semester. It started snowing around 5 a.m., so by then the ground was covered in white snow. I took my usual route by the bayou and through the woods for half a mile to get home. The sun was starting to set while I was listening to music on my playlist. I began heading towards the woods. As I get about 1/8 of my way into the woods, I hear this low growling sound. We did have coyotes around these parts, so that's what I assumed it was. It begins to get closer, and I realize how much it sounds like a wolf. I stop and try to stand my ground, because running from a predator like that seemed like a really bad idea. Then I hear something behind me as well. I'm freaking out now. No way it could be wolves, I think to myself. But it sounds like a whole pack of them. Just my luck. Something emerges from the woods and lets out a deep, bone-chilling howl. But a wolf it was not. Whatever this was standing 7 to 8 feet tall and had dark black fur covering its body, and its eyes were an icy blue and looked more human. Even its arms and torso looked very human-like, but its legs and head were more like a wolf. My mind begins to race as to what this thing is and what it wants. It dropped on all fours and lunged out at me, or at least I thought it did. Instead, it lunges at the bushes. When I look over, there's another one, and both of these things are going at it, attacking each other. I was fascinated, but horrified. They were focused on each other, so I took the opportunity to attempt an escape. But my plan failed, and I'm still not sure what happened. Something just hit me, and I blacked out. What I remember next is a woman shouting at me, asking me if I'm okay. I was apparently covered in blood and dirt. My clothes were torn and my back was burning. The woman helped me up and helped me to her car. She drove me to the hospital. On the way there, I noticed my arm was throbbing. When we made it to the hospital, I was taken to a room. The apparent claw marks on my back were disinfected and stitched up, and an x-ray after that told me that my right arm was broken, so they put it in a cast. I was soon discharged, and my brother picked me up. All in all, for an animal attack, I'd say my injuries were pretty minor. This happened about 1 year and 5 months ago as of writing this. I'm okay now, and I don't walk that way after dark anymore. I've moved to the US this summer and resumed college. I still take walks at night, and I do definitely believe that something exists out there. Something that resembles the werewolves on TV. Luckily for me, I have never seen one since. Just stay safe and follow your gut. This is our life here. From ArmoredPigeon. This is the first time I've told this story in a manner like this. Now, I'm not a native English speaker or writer. I live in Brazil, and my family do not have anything extraordinary about them. My dad's an engineer and my mother is a psychologist. I'm 30 now, but this story occurred when I was maybe 10 or 11, sometime in that gap. It was the period of school break. Here it occurs in the middle of the year. So me, my cousin, who was a little older, maybe 13, and her brother, who was the same age, went to our grandparents' house. They lived in the countryside. They live in a state called Minas Gerais. We went to stay for about 7 days. The first 6 days were perfect. Not too cold, not too hot, the relaxing sound of animals, the fresh smell of coffee every day, that delicious farm food that my grandma did so well, a true paradise for a child. And then the night of the 6th day. I'll never forget that. The sounds, the sensations. For some reason, that day I was having trouble sleeping. My cousins were already fast asleep. I decided to walk to the kitchen to get a cup of water or something to drink. With luck, we would have some Coca-Cola in there. When I made it to the kitchen, I found my 2 uncles, who lived on the farm ground to help my grandparents with all the farm things and all that. They were talking about something. When they saw me, they smiled and continued their conversation. I don't remember what they were talking about, but it was lighthearted. Then one of them closed the door. I saw that there was an enormous quantity of locks on the door, including one that was a wooden bar that was placed horizontally over it. I didn't say anything, I just grabbed my water, then drank it before going back to our room. Later on in the night, I was awakened by the sounds of loud voices. I looked around a little lost, and I saw my cousin holding her sister in his arms. She was crying a lot and said, "You hear that, Matthias?" when she saw that I was awake. I then heard one of my uncles screaming, "It's coming back!" Soon after, I heard the first gunshot I'd ever heard in my life. I think it was a hunting rifle. I'm not a weapons guy, so I don't know the type. I nearly screamed. Then one of my uncles went into the room, a rifle in his hands. He saw us and seemed relieved. He smiled, but before he went back, he told us, "Stay away from the windows." And we did just that. For the next hour, I think, we three just got together and waited. I swear I remember the sound of something big circling around the property. It reminded me of when a dog walks, the sound of 4 legs hitting the ground. The sound of heavy breathing came really close to our window. Then there was a bang. My cousin screamed, and my uncle came into the room and led us to the kitchen. He never lost sight of that window, training the gun there. Then there was nothing, just dead silence. We slept in the kitchen, and one of my uncles stayed awake all night with us. In the morning, all seemed like a bad dream. But then I went out because I loved the smell of grass in the morning, and I saw these huge claw marks on the outside of the door. They looked 6 centimeters wide, enormous, and these huge dog-like footprints were around the house too. I asked the uncle that took us out of our room, and he said to me, like it was normal, "Well, this is our life here." A Summer Nightmare from Walshy. I'm a 17-year-old guy, and my best friend Connor is about a year younger than me. He's got some woods behind his house that leads to a park with a path to his house. This all happened in the summer of 2019. Connor and I were just chilling in the woods with a small fire going in front of the log we were sitting on. While we were talking about our favorite childhood shows through our cigarettes, we heard some twigs snapping. Since it was dark out and there were both deer and raccoons in the area, we didn't pay much attention to this. A few minutes later, I get this feeling like I was being watched, so I mentioned it, only to get a "just ignore it" from Connor. So I took his advice and began talking about whatever was going on in the world at that point. At around 10 p.m., we heard a massive cracking sound, like a thick log being broken. I shined my phone's flashlight in the area the sound had come from, and I saw nothing. But I guess Connor saw something, because he took my phone and walked over there. A few steps in, he stopped, and without even looking at me, he whispered, "Run. Don't look. Just put out the fire and run." Naturally, this scared the heck out of me, so I did as he said, and we were both out of there and in the park within a few seconds. When we were walking back to his house from the park, I asked him what he saw. He said it was a tall, dog-like creature with dark brown fur. The following day, we went back to see what broke, and we found a tree about 5 inches in diameter had been snapped in half. From that point on, we've never stayed in those woods so long after dark.